Good evening, everyone, or good morning if you're watching us from North America. I'd like to welcome everybody on another edition of the Heretics podcast on Voten TV. I hope everybody had a great Christmas, and I hope the start of your new year has been a good one. Um, Today, we have a chance to host once again Douglas Macgregor on our podcast, and we will discuss the situation in Ukraine, obviously, and other geopolitical topics of relevance. Doug, it's a pleasure to welcome you again on Votem TV.
Good.
Doug, I want to start with a general question about the battlefield situation currently that we're dealing with in Ukraine, because a lot has changed since our last interview. So, what's your take on where things are going in terms of the broad military situation in eastern Ukraine?
Well, I think we focus a little bit in the south first, and keep in mind that the Ukrainians constructed what amounts to, in the view of some analysts, three lines of defense in depth facing the Russians in the enclave that the Russians currently control. Those lines of defense seem to be largely crumbling, and the Ukrainians have taken the Russian bait, launched endless counterattacks, and just about bled themselves to death trying to throw the Russians out, which of course they cannot do. And I think what was just happened south of Zaporizhia is instructive. If you look at that area, there's a defensive line. It's not really a very substantial defense by any means, but it's a line about 50 kilometers long, stretching from the southwest to the northeast in front of Zaporozhye. The 15th Army, Russian forces advanced towards that area, encountered some resistance, but in the meantime, the Ukrainians seem to have rushed several thousand troops down there. And I've heard some people say 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, we don't know. But if we look at how the Russians have handled this, I think it tells us a great deal about what we're likely to see in the future. And that is that the Ukrainians have shown up with infantry. They have no armored platforms down there whatsoever. And so they end up putting these infantrymen into battle positions around which presumably the Russians can swirl at some point. But the Russians look at this and their view is, at the moment, they're not doing anything. They're letting these people set up. They could care less because the light infantry there is not a high-value target. They can brush through that when they need to. But what they plan to do, and what we're seeing increasingly, is that they'll look for any air defense systems that they can find. They send in drones with warheads to destroy those, particularly the radars, first and foremost. Once the radars are gone, the air defense systems aren't very useful. They'll use loitering munitions. And if they've stripped away all of the air defense systems and they've eliminated most of the tanks and artillery systems, then they'll move forward and finish off everything on the ground with direct fire. Ukrainians don't have much artillery. They don't have much in the way of armor. And, talking about bringing in tanks, if you look at the sum total that are being promised sometime in the next 6 to 12 months, 81, I think it said 81 tanks, British, American, and German. What will 81 tanks do across 50 kilometers against the 15th Army? The answer is not a whole hell of a lot, especially since most of them will probably be neutralized or destroyed long before the 15th Army closes with them. So this is a different way of war. This is this framework where you're a complex, if you will, where you link all of the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms in space and above the battlefield and the terrestrial arena with all the strike systems at your disposal. The Russians have gotten quite good at this. They provide very accurate data to all of their artillery systems. And that's why 75% of all the Ukrainian casualties taken in this war have been inflicted with standoff attack, strike, artillery systems. I think that's where the war is headed. We're sitting around now. Well, the Russians have the initiative. It looks like they're getting out of Bakhmut, which makes sense. The Russians have left a road open. Now they can sweep it with artillery, but they'll lose fewer people leaving than they will by staying, obviously. So I think at some point this line is going to simply crumble, and they'll start moving north and northwest. And it's anybody's guess when the Russians decide to launch their offensives.
Do you expect the offensive to take on the character of somewhat of a Russian blitzkrieg, or will they just, in your opinion, intensify the meat grinding that's taking place with the additional troops that have been mobilized?
One of the things that's impressed me about the Russian commanders is their concern for their soldiers. I mean, that's why a lot of these comparisons with the Soviet Union are just outrageous nonsense, especially when people try to characterize the behavior of the Russian soldiers as like those of the Soviet troops. Nothing could be further from the truth. And as a result, there is a preference for the methodical grinder, as you point out. It will be accelerated, and in some areas they will move faster than others. But as a general rule, I think this methodical meat grinder will start moving in the east first. If you look at the concentration of Russian forces in and around Belgrade and down in the south, and I don't know which avenue, maybe they'll use 2 or 3 avenues coming out of the south. I mean, they could go up through Zaporozhye or further north, closer to the Oxal River, wherever they go. But it'll be a very methodical approach because they simply don't want to waste Russian lives. And I sometimes get the impression the Russians are willing to let a lot of these Ukrainians go. I know that sounds strange, but one of the reports that came in from the 15th Army was that they encountered large numbers of Ukrainian troops that after a short firefight basically tossed their weapons and left. But the Russians pointed out that's understandable because these are people that have been forced to fight, recently dragooned into the army. They're given a few NCOs or officers. As soon as the fighting gets hot, the NCOs and officers leave, and the soldiers are on their own, and they say, well, why should we sit here and become meat for the grinder? I think we're going to see more of that, and we're also seeing a very intensified campaign behind the lines by the SBU, from Kherson all the way to Kiev and all the way out to Transcarpathia, where they're trying to round up Hungarians. You can imagine how excited the Hungarians in Western Ukraine are about fighting the Russians in Eastern Ukraine. This is a tragedy. It's a disaster. It is the worst thing that I think we've seen since the Second World War. At least in the Second World War, there were some reasons to fight. This time, this is just stupid. It's a waste of human capital.
Just staying with the Eastern Front, the reports that are coming from the Western press, and I've seen this in the Washington Post, is that the Ukrainians have conducted an orderly evacuation from Bakhmut. Now, from what I saw, it was anything but orderly. They were just being killed and they were running away from Bakhmut. So who's right here?
Well, we're going to try to put a happy face on the dead rat whenever we're able to do so. And that's what the Ukrainian cause is. It's a dead rat. You listen to Zelensky and his spinmeisters talk, and they're on another planet. So I don't place much value in anything that comes through the mainstream Western press. Figure that these are concocted narratives that are then spewed out ad nauseum. I think the truth is more along the lines that you've said. And Ukrainians sent back messages that were translated, provided to me, saying, we're better off leaving and taking the casualties, getting out, however the hell we can get out, than sitting here and being annihilated. And that's been the argument for how many weeks? And apparently Zelensky would not give them permission to withdraw. Again, this is, in his mind, all about politics and the criticality of maintaining the facade of some degree of order and capability so that people will ship more money to them and equipment.
Well, sound military advice from a sound military leader such as Zelensky. Doug, I want to transfer a bit to the results of that famous Ramstein meeting that took place. You are very familiar with armored warfare. I don't think I have to tell my audience about your bio. You took part in the Battle of 73 Easting. You were there. You saw it. So how would you assess the following words, knowing how many tanks the United Kingdom, Poland, the United States now, as it was announced yesterday by Biden, these are the words of Ben Wallace when he addressed the British Parliament just after the Ramstein meeting. I quote, "The international community recognizes that equipping Ukraine to push Russia out of its territory is as important as equipping them to defend what they already have. Today's package is an important increase in Ukraine's capabilities. it means they can go from resisting to expelling the Russian forces from Ukrainian soil. So, Doug, will those tanks expel the Russians from Ukrainian soil? Why or why not?
Well, how do I put this? I have to give this some careful consideration. No, nothing like it in the world. The warfare that we're seeing now guarantees with almost perfect certainty that more than half of those tanks will be destroyed long before they manage to close with the Russians. The other thing is that we can talk all you want about the amount of training time and maintenance infrastructure and logistical problems, those things. We don't need to go all over that. Everybody's covered it. But the truth is, if you got them into an area, how would you integrate them into your existing units? Because that's what's most important. You're not going to take 50 or 100 tanks, as was done during the Second World War by the Russians, for instance, on more than one occasion, mass them and then throw them at the enemy, because they're simply going to be destroyed quickly. No, they have to be integrated within your existing force. They have to have air defense. They have to have air and missile defense. If you cannot shoot down these drones that are being directed at you with precision guidance, you're just going to sit there and watch these tanks evaporate, vanish in a hail of gunfire. So I don't see this happening at all. I don't see anybody ejecting anyone from anywhere. I've listened to lots of fanciful statements recently about, potential for us to intervene, which I think is of sheer lunacy in the West. We're not organized properly to deal with this kind of warfare either. 75% of all the casualties inflicted on the Ukrainians have come from artillery systems. When I say artillery, I'm not just talking about the sort of standard hard shell and mortar rounds. I'm talking about rockets, tactical ballistic missiles, all of those things. 75%. And the Russians can fire about up to 60,000 rounds a day. That includes rockets and missiles. The Ukrainians on their best day are lucky if they can get off 6,500. You cannot win in this kind of static battlefield environment that way. The Ukrainians can't maneuver in it. If you can't maneuver it, then you're thrown back on attrition. And attrition is a bad way to fight. And right now, the Russians have the upper hand with strike. And even though we are providing the ISR and brilliant information on the Russians to the Ukrainians, they can't really exploit it because they can't get out from under the strike threat. So the short answer is, I think the man is delusional. But he's a light infantryman. Right. He probably believes that these poor bastards are going to survive and win. It doesn't work out that way.
Doug, what do you make of the reports that William Burns, who was in Kiev, William Burns obviously being the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, he was in Kiev on an unannounced visit recently, and apparently, that's what the Western press is reporting from unnamed sources, he told Zelensky that after July, it might get hard to get equipment from the West, especially from the States. What are you seeing in Washington? Are the Republicans really seriously approaching the question of, hey, not only should we audit what we already sent, but we should, end what we're planning to send? What's your take?
It's mixed. Remember that, like most people's governments, we have the best government money can buy. And large numbers of people on the Hill benefit enormously in terms of campaign contributions from doing the bidding of their donors. Those donors want war with Russia. They think that harming Russia is a good thing and that somehow or another we benefit from it. I obviously think that's nonsense and don't support it, but that's the feeling. And I don't see that ebbing dramatically. Now, you said by July. Well, maybe that's true. We don't know what's going to happen. I'm not even sure that the Kiev regime and this state called Ukraine will be around by July. I just don't know. I think Burns is also been trying to tell them to do things differently on the ground, as have many of our military advisors. And they have not, or only taken some of the advice and not most of it. It's a very hard-headed group, Ukrainians are tough people, and I understand what they're trying to do. Unfortunately, I think it's a bad cause in the wrong place, but I think Burns was probably as truthful as he could be, and I do think the Ukrainians need to be concerned about that. But the problem is that when you tell them that, they tend to do stupid things. Let's sacrifice another 5,000 or 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers in order to show people that we're alive, kicking and well, and can win. That's not really the answer. They should be building reserves right now and falling back, frankly, to more defensible terrain. But if you're going to maintain the fiction that within a year they're going to launch offensives to regain control of Crimea, which, I think is absurd to even suggest such a thing, but that's being floated, and people in Washington still believe that's possible, then I guess you do what you do.
I want to pull up a quote. Łukasz, if we can pull up the tweet. Yes. So Michael Tracy commented on this, that addressing a Chamber of Commerce meeting in Boca Raton today, this is a few days ago, Zelensky thanks BlackRock, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and others for their support of Ukraine. Adds that sending Ukraine heavier weapons like Abrams tanks represents a big business opportunity for U.S. corporations. Doug, you know very well the quote by Smedley Butler, who said that war is a racket. He even wrote a book entitled War is a Racket. Yeah. What's your comment when you see this blatant admission from Zelensky that, it's really coming to a point where you throw away the talk about democracy, freedom, and let's just make some money?
Well, the first thing I would tell people is that if you look at the heads of those firms, whether it's BlackRock or Goldman Sachs and these other things, they're many of the same people that brought on this disaster in 2008, the financial crisis. And tragically, we made a terrible mistake. We bailed everyone out, with very few exceptions, at 100% on the dollar. But in fact, at the time, many other more prudent financial analysts said we should bail them out at 10 cents on the dollar, because many of these firms deserve to go out of existence, because they have in fact created the crisis that we're living through that has ruined so many lives in the United States. I think we're on the road to a financial economic Pearl Harbor in this country. I don't know when it's going to strike. Jeremy Grantham, who's a very well-known analyst, said that the S&P, Standards & Poor, is going to lose 50% of its value over the next few months. If we end up in a confrontation just beyond the border, Polish border with the Russians, I would see that happening in the space of 2 or 3 days. That would be worse than anything we saw in 1929. So nobody is thinking right now about all these implications. Greed seems to be the overriding consideration, and Zelensky is appealing to the greed. Now, we could waste a lot of time talking about Zelensky's checkered past and all the various people in his, some people would say criminal syndicate in Kiev that are squirreling away money in Cyprus banks and elsewhere. I don't know. And we've seen this recent firing of all of these alleged corrupt officials that have always been there, who are likely to be replaced by more corrupt officials. And somebody said, well, that's because the Americans are taking over the government. Look, the place is the 51st state now in financial terms. We own it. We own the government. We own the whole mess. I think this is all about saving face in Washington. People in Washington do sense that this is not going to work out. What they don't know is what to do about it. How do they escape accountability from this? Now, many of them assume that Americans will be as they have been in the past, complacent, and simply say, oh, well, that didn't work, move on. The problem is that people in the United States are beginning to suffer from the economic conditions. So I think they're a little worried that they're not going to escape from this. So to go back to your original point about what happens in July, depends an awful lot on what happens here with the American people and how bad things get. And it would be a mistake to disconnect what's happening in Ukraine with what's happening here, because it does have a financial, economic, and most important, a psychological impact. And in most cases, people behave the way they do for reasons that don't necessarily follow logic. So, in that sense, I think there are reasons for the people to be worried over in Kiev, that they may be left in the middle of the lake without any more oars in the water. But again, I can't predict with absolute certainty. And I'm troubled by the fact that I continue to see a lot more American military equipment and soldiers arrive in Poland and elsewhere.
Doug, Annalena Baerbock, whom you've probably heard of, yes, she's one of our favorite characters.
The Außenministerium, I know, the Auswärtigsamt, Annalena Baerbock.
Yes, she
is pointing.
a few days ago, I think it was yesterday or the day before in the European Parliament, she said, I quote, "We are at war with Russia and we shouldn't be at war with each other." Now, I've seen commentators all over the social media sphere not only stating that, okay, so now the Russians have a legal basis to attack anything that brings weapons into Ukraine because it's been stated openly that, yes, we're at war. Now, our Polish government hasn't stated it in those clear terms, but everybody gets the idea that's where we are and where we're going. But it's interesting because you did see some opposition in the German parliament when they had the debate about whether we're going to send the tanks or not. And actually some very strong words came from like Peter Bistron from the Alternative für Deutschland. And all of a sudden you have this complete turnaround from, Scholz and his government, although I'm pretty sure they had some internal debates about this. And, Baerbock all of a sudden comes out just to, bring down any fears in Washington. And she comes out with a statement, we're at war with Russia. So has Germany's position become worse after those words? Because I'm pretty sure the Russians have taken notice, and it seems, at least from what Peskov said, that they did.
I was sent some data this morning from Germany that said that 63% of Germans polled on the question of sending more equipment to Ukraine said no. They specifically asked about the Ukrainian request for fighter aircraft. Now, there are also roughly the same number that are uncomfortable with the tanks. I think the Germans are slowly waking up. The Germanic countries are shamelessly conformist, and it takes them a long time to finally disengage from dumb ideas. They'll probably stay with a dumb idea longer than any other people on the planet. I think it was Schumpeter, or Hayek that said, well, if anybody can make socialism work, it's the Germans. Because even though it makes no sense, if they decide to do it, they'll find a way to make it work until it falls apart, literally. I think that's what we're seeing happen inside Germany right now. Scholz gave a speech and told everybody how great everything is. Everyone's warm and cozy in Parliament. We've compensated for the lack of natural gas. Happiness, flowers, bunny rabbits, and deer are all prancing through the woods. Everyone's happy and well. That's not the case, and the Germans are not fooled. So I think Annalena Baerbock's comment has really upset people because they're beginning to say, no, wait a minute, we thought the Ukrainians deserved our help, but we didn't sign on for a war with Russia. And of course, you have to ask, what the hell did you think was going to happen? Now, fortunately, the men in the Kremlin are not stupid. And from the very beginning, they have done a great deal to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States and NATO. I mean, frankly speaking, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline was an act of war against Russia and Germany. I mean, stop and think about it. The Germans are beginning to wake up. And, I was talking this morning to some people in Switzerland, and they said, what do you think has to change? I said, the only thing that can change anything right now is for people in Berlin and Paris and other major European capitals that suddenly say, we've gone as far as we're going to go and no further. This has to end, because we know, and I think you were the one that sent me a map of the polling data across Europe, that overwhelmingly people want a negotiated settlement. And we're all supposed to unconditionally support this regime that we created and installed in Kiev as long as they demand it. Well, that's insane. Why? Does it really make a great deal of difference to us who controls the Donbass? Right now the Russians are sitting on everything in Ukraine that is worth anything. That's the sad part. These people are fools. So I don't. I think we're going to see change in Germany, and when that happens, maybe we'll see a sea change elsewhere. You tell me, are we going to see a sea change in Poland? The Poles also coming to grips with the reality that this is not necessarily something they want to sign up with. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. You know that I'm personally a great admirer of Piłsudski, always have been. And I shared his dream in 1911. He was brilliant. He said, there's going to be a great war. And the Germans and the Austrians are going to fight the Russians, the British, and the French. And they're going to win until the United States enters the war and turns it against them. That will be Poland's great opportunity. And then he talked about trying to recreate a confederation, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine. Agree. And I and many other people at the time, even in Germany, thought, well, this is a wonderful way to protect against Bolshevism. Of course, there were a lot of people that also felt that we should eventually kill that child in his cradle as well. Today is not 1918, 1919, 1920. The people in the Kremlin are not communists. They are not Bolsheviks, and they aren't bent on the bloody invasion and destruction of Europe. Absolutely not. If anything, they'd like to get back to some degree of normality. That's what people in Poland need to understand. And I share the dream, but I don't share the method. And that's the concern that I have right now with the United States. In the United States, nobody knows any of that. Nobody knows anything about Eastern Europe. Hell, nobody knew anything about Eastern Europe at Versailles when the treaty was designed. If they had, we'd have done things differently. So you're dealing with a culture and a nation in the West that really doesn't understand Eastern Europe, period. Now, the East Europeans think, well, we can leverage America. That's tough. You can only get so much out of us. And then the average man on the street in St. Louis and Seattle says, where's this place? What are you talking about? Why are we doing this? And we have our other problems. We can't even recruit for the armed forces at this point because the average red-blooded American man looks at what's happening in the armed forces and says, good God, I don't want to be part of that. So I'm sorry to wander a little off target, but it's all connected.
I mean, sorry to be very blunt, but I mean, you people over there don't even have a southern border. So, I mean, at least from what I'm seeing, maybe I'm watching biased
that's right.
television.
A lot of Americans are saying, why aren't the troops on our border? Well, we know why. It's deliberate.
Right.
Of this cardboard cutout of a president. He's not in charge. Others are.
Well, he does keep referring to Kamala as Madam President, so by his own admission sometimes, right?
Well, that's frightening.
Doug, I have a question from a somewhat contrarian observer on Twitter who's also been following your work. He sent me 3 questions that he would like me to address with you. I'm going to address one. I'm not going to give him the satisfaction, but he said that he believes that you were wrong when you said that the approach to Kiev, which originally took place after the 24th of February, wasn't a feint. It was a Russian failure. That the Russians backed away because the Ukrainians were massing, and it was just, strategically unsound. So that's his claim that you were wrong. What do you have to say to that?
He could be right. I could still be right. I don't know. The thing that struck me about the whole operation was that it wasn't very Russian in the sense that it was on the fly. I didn't see evidence for systematic planning. If you go back and look at the Soviets who went into Kabul when they first decided to intervene with Soviet-Russian forces then, because remember, the forces that replaced the original European-dominated forces that went into Afghanistan came out of Central Asia. That's an entirely different story, and they behaved differently. But when the airborne forces went into Kabul, it was extremely well organized. It had been thoroughly rehearsed in ad nauseum. I didn't see evidence for that. The second point is all the forces that you see today operating in the field have not been in that field operating for decades. When we went to the desert in 1990, and we ended up with 2 Army Corps plus supporting forces, almost 300,000 troops, we hadn't put a force that size designed to attack and maneuver for 40, 50 years. The Russians went in, and I think they tried to do a lot of things on the basis of assumptions that proved invalid, and it didn't go well. Surprise, surprise. If you go back, people always talk about 1939. Well, look what the Germans did. Germans made a lot of mistakes in 1939. There were several incidents where Polish infantry forces stopped the Germans dead in their tracks. And Blaskowitz talked about that. Things don't go well when you go into an operation after decades of inexperience. So my point is that I just don't think it was well planned. I think it was more of an on-the-fly thing. And I think it turned out to ultimately work to their advantage because they were really trying to draw off troops from other areas because they were really focused on the Donbass.
Right.
But we'll find out in the future, and he may be right.
It could be both in essence, right? Last question pertains to, because this has also been getting traction in the Western press, the shakeup that apparently took place in the Russian high command. So Gerasimov taking over the theater in Ukraine, Surovikin being demoted to heading air operations. In your estimation, as you see it, is it really a shakeup, a punishment for Surovikin, or are they basically strategically realigning themselves in terms of the command structure in Ukraine for what's needed ahead?
Well, I don't see why anybody would fire Surovikin, because he did a brilliant job. If you look at the targeting strategy that he implements and his use of cruise missiles and tactical ballistic missiles and so forth, it's had a profoundly positive impact from the Russian standpoint. He's handled that very well, and he turned that around within a few days. So I don't see any evidence for punishment. One of the things that I do see evidence for is that the Russians are results-oriented. They're not unreasonable. In other words, the political leadership reaching President Putin is not behaving irrationally like Stalin did on many occasions. He's behaving very rationally and recognizes that in many cases, the commanders that were there at the beginning, several of them needed to go away. They were not the right men at the right time in the right place. We relieved, before the First World War really got off the ground, we had relieved 24 major commanders on the ground. And by the time the war was over, it was 32 or more. And I think this is a healthy sign. I wish that we had done something similar back in 1990 and 91. We didn't. There were ample grounds to do that. We didn't do it in Vietnam. In other words, we tended to take the position, well, who's the next man in line? We'll have to put him in. The Russians aren't doing that. So I would say that we should probably go in fear of the Russians, because they will act swiftly and decisively to achieve several things. Number one, unity of command, because without unity of command, there is no unity of effort. The Russians understand that very well. We do not. And then secondly, personalities do matter. Different personalities are suited to different environments. There are personalities that thrive in this long, meat-grinding attrition warfare, and there are other personalities that don't. It doesn't mean one is right, one is wrong. It means that you find the right person for the right purpose. And then finally, Putin and his inner circle has listened to Russian soldiers in the field. Russian soldiers have sent letters. Russian soldiers have spoken to newsmen. Journalists said, look, I don't know where this man came from that you put in command of this brigade, but he's an idiot. He got several people killed. They removed him. I mean, to me, that's a pretty damn good sign that people do care and are listening. In other words, this is not a leadership that is remote from the suffering of its people in the field. On the other hand, I think you can make a very strong case that there is complete divorce between many of the Ukrainian forces and their leadership in Kiev. And it's growing uglier with each passing day.
Definitely seems so. Doug, once again, thank you for your brilliant insight. We hope to have you on the show soon. Again, I'm pretty sure the situation will be developing at a much faster pace than our last interview and possibly even this one. Thank you once again from all of us here. And I'd just like to remind our viewers that on Tuesday, at the exact same hour as today, we will be interviewing Darren J. Beatty, who is the editor-in-chief of Revolver News and former speechwriter for President Donald Trump. Hope to see you all then. In the meantime, have a good evening, have a good day, take care, and Doug, thank you once again.
Sure, thank you very much, Mike.